All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first and hopefully not last podcast, The Divide in Line. I am your host, Josiah Hind. We are excited to be launching this podcast as we begin this journey, as we begin to discuss social and political topics. I'm your host, like I said, Josiah Hind. I'm from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Just to kind of warm up, this is our first podcast. So we're doing a little bit of an intro launch, and basically I'm going to just kind of explain my brief story. So I was born and raised in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I spent 4.5 years over in South America as a missionary and social worker. I am a Christian. I hold to the Bible, and I love to discuss politics as well as read articles on politics. I was homeschooled. I was not ever enrolled in public school. I've never been to college, but I definitely am thankful for the upbringing that I've had, where I've been able to understand how to think in a critical way. I have a lot of friends on both sides of the spectrum, and I really think that this podcast is going to be good. So basically, the reason why I felt like I needed to do this podcast is for a number of reasons. The first is that I think that it is important in today's world that we have the liberty to express what we believe and think about political and social topics. And so I've always been one where I've enjoyed engaging in even some of my listeners on social media, on my Facebook page, personal Facebook page, where I've had chances to engage people in conversations regards to political topics. So that was kind of the first reason, was that I found that it was free and it was enjoyable to be able to express what you believe, even if you're wrong, or even if you're right. It was that idea that in America we have that right to be able to do so, because a lot of countries they don't have that right. That's just a fact. I mean, you can travel to a lot of different countries and know that you don't have that right to be able to freely express your political views. And so we live in a country where we are blessed to be able to express our political views. And so the first reason why I wanted to launch this podcast is actually for that very reason, because we have a right to be able to express what we believe. And that right is quickly being taken away, and we're gonna hear more about that as we progress in our podcast series, as we progress in this show that we're doing here. It's actually really exciting, the things we've got planned for this podcast. The second reason why I wanted to do this podcast is really for the purpose of being informed, of staying informed, and as well as keeping you all informed. Doing a podcast really brings on a responsibility, because I have to make sure that I'm staying on top of what's happening as well. In a world still filled with so much social media and so many different ways to get information, sometimes it can get overwhelming in knowing where to go to. And so I definitely don't offer to have the perfect stuff or perfect news, but I definitely think that it's important that we are staying informed and that we are aware of what's going on in our world today. The third reason why I wanted to do this podcast is frankly because it's been kind of a dream of mine. I've kind of always thought it would be cool to have a talk show, kind of do a podcast. We all wanted to do something when we were younger. Never really thought about doing this necessarily, but in the more recent months, I've really thought, I'm inspired by a lot of different talk shows. I listen to a lot of different podcasts. And so I guess that was kind of the reason why I wanted to do this podcast, was just because I was excited for the opportunity to finally kind of step out and do this as a fulfillment of, I guess a goal or dream of mine. So those are some of the reasons why I want to get this podcast launched. I also want to talk about the purpose of this podcast. It's a good question. As we start off with our intro podcast, it's a good question to ask, what's the purpose of this podcast? Should I even bother listening to you talk for X amount of minutes? Because are you even going to have anything that is worth listening to? Well, I'm glad you asked. So the purpose of this podcast is basically to bring to my listeners a balanced, and I guess I should say as balanced as we're able to, discussion on political topics as well as updates on recent political events, social events, social issues that are rising in America and in the United States specifically. And just the purpose of this podcast is really to be able to all think critically. We actually have a few plans for this podcast that have to do with that. One of the plans we have is to actually have on guest on this podcast. Hopefully, that's kind of our goal. I've already got a guest lined up for the next few weeks out. We've actually got a guest that we're hoping to have on the show. So I'm getting kind of excited about that we may even have our first guest on the show. And the other purpose of this podcast is to have civilized conversations with people from both sides of the spectrum. I've got a few people in mind I've been thinking about having on this show, and they're from the, I guess what you would call the left. They have opposite views of what I have. I tend to lean more towards the right. I also have somebody I'm thinking about having on the show that's kind of in the middle. So, I'm just excited about an opportunity to have a podcast where the purpose of this podcast is to have civilized conversations with civilized people, where we can sit down, we can drink a cup of coffee, drink a Coke, and we can discuss these social and political issues. And I'm also hoping the other purpose of this podcast is to keep it local. I'm hoping to have perhaps some local people on this show as well. I would love to have the mayor. I would love to have local representatives or local people from my state and from my city. That would be the goal, because there's so many podcasts and talk shows out there where it's all celebrities and all big name people within the political realm of the United States. And I think it would be cool to be able to have civilized conversations with people that are your average Joe, that is your neighbor, that are perhaps business people in your city, that is a mayor, perhaps they're police officers, perhaps any number of jobs, any number of careers, that these people would be able to come and sit down and we could have civilized conversations. So that's kind of the purpose of this podcast, is to be able to discuss political issues that are facing the United States today and social issues. So that, my friends, is the purpose of this podcast. Probably wondering, well, why is it called The Divided Line? That doesn't seem very balanced if you're trying to have a unbiased podcast, but you call it The Divided Line. It seems kind of like an oxymoron. Well, I think it's important to kind of explain that. So the idea is, I wanted to go with a different name. I actually wanted to go with The Bottom Line, because that's kind of my phrase. Like, the bottom line is, but that was actually taken already by another podcast. So I ended up going with The Divided Line, and the purpose is because I believe that you can have a civilized conversation with other people who have different views than yourself. But I believe that at some point you reach a point where there is a divided line between those views, and between perhaps the way somebody views something, that there's always going to be that divided line. And it's just that idea of being able to come and have civilized conversations together on that line. As there is a divided line, and that line is continuing to grow even in the United States today. There really seems to be that growing divided line in the political realm today. I definitely believe that we are drawing further and further apart politically in the parties of both the left and the right. And there's always going to be that divided line to a degree, from the left and the right, because obviously at some point the views simply cannot coincide with each other. And I want to say something to my listeners real quick. I do apologize if I'm repeating myself a lot on this first podcast. Just so excited about what we've got on this podcast and what is coming up. So with having said all of that, I think it's just important to kind of get an idea of where I stand politically as well. So I am a registered Republican. I am a Christian, as I said. So to my left friends that are listening, you probably are about ready to turn off this podcast, but I actually ask that you do not. And the purpose of it really is I voted for Trump, But I didn't vote for Trump because I think he's a Christian, because frankly, I don't know if he is. And I know that statement would even perhaps ripple the feathers of some of my closer Christian friends in the political realm, or at least in the immediate circle of my life. I also didn't vote for Trump because I thought that he was going to be the best president ever. I mean, I guess I can definitely say that he has done a better job than what I even anticipated him doing. I voted for Trump because he was the best out of the options that we had at the time of the presidential election. And I know obviously some of my listeners may disagree with that, and that's perfectly fine. You're entitled to your opinion. So where I stand as a Republican is I am very conservative. I proudly say that I am a conservative. I'm pro-life. I'm a conservative. I believe in our Second Amendment rights, and I've always voted Republican. But that doesn't mean that I can't have an opinion. That doesn't mean that I can't have a civilized conversation. And I think that that's where the issue is today, is that we immediately throw out the other person's viewpoint because it doesn't coincide with what we think, or it doesn't go with what we think, so therefore that person must be wrong. And I'm not even talking about just the left and how they treat the right. I'm referring to even how sometimes the right can respond to the left, that sometimes things are said by both parties where it's not accurate. And so I think it's important to understand that even though I'm pro-life, I'm very conservative in my beliefs, and those beliefs will come out on this podcast. I am still open to having a discussion. Like I said earlier, we're going to have people on the show with different views. So I think that's important to keep in mind going into this podcast, just understanding that at the end of the day, we're still human beings. And at the end of the day, each person's entitled to their opinion, right or wrong. So with that being said, let's just go ahead and dive into what has happened in the last week in the political realm. It always seems like that every week there's just some form of craziness that happens in the political realm. And with last week being Easter, we know that there was quite a bit of political riffles of feathers when former President Obama, who is, by the way, is still apparently trying to run some of the show, or at least is very much involved in politics still, quoted on his Twitter account, "The attacks on tourists and Easter worshippers in Sri Lanka are an attack on humanity. On a day devoted to love, redemption, and renewal, we pray for the victims and stand with the people of Sri Lanka." Okay, that sounds kind of sweet, right? "On this holy weekend for many faiths, we must stand united, hatred and violence. I'm praying for everyone affected by today's horrific attacks on Easter worshippers and travelers in Sri Lanka." Okay, that second quote that I read, that was actually from Hillary Clinton, which also, by the way, she's still somehow doing her thing in the Democratic Party. I'm not really sure how that's happening still. That's a whole different topic. But basically, okay, first off, notice that it says the attacks on Easter worshipers. That's what I'm grabbing. And I'm sure that my listeners have probably already seen on their social media the controversy that has surrounded this Twitter post. I know that I'm a little late to come into the game. But what's crazy is that when the Muslim attack happened in New Zealand, which that was a tragedy, trust me, that was a tragedy. And I am in no way a supporter of what happened in New Zealand. I believe that was definitely a tragedy that should not have occurred. But when that tragedy occurred in New Zealand, the media, the left, said what it was. It was an attack on Muslims. That's just a fact. That's not even anything that has to do with racism. That is a fact. It was an attack on Muslims. It was not right. I will agree with that it was not called for and it was not right, that attack on Muslims. But at least the media called it an attack on Muslims. But now we have former President Obama and Hillary Clinton both saying that there was an attack on Easter worshipers. I mean, the whole craziness of all of this is, and I don't understand, and maybe perhaps somebody can help me understand this, and if you can, go ahead and shoot me a message on social media. The crazy part about all this is I don't understand how hard it is to just not simply say there was an attack on Christians. I mean, we said it about Muslims when there was an attack in New Zealand. I bet if there was an attack in a Buddhist temple over in Asia somewhere, that they would also say the same thing. There was an attack on Buddhist worshippers. But no, we have to call them Easter worshippers because somehow it's probably a bad thing if he calls them Christians. Because then he would have to actually acknowledge that Christianity is in fact being attacked worldwide. But no, former President Obama and Hillary Clinton had to go and say that it was an attack on Easter worshippers. And anyway, so that's my rant. That's my rant. You can disagree with me. That's fine. I just need somebody to try to explain to me why they think that calling them Easter worshippers was okay, and I am willing to listen to that comment. Because frankly, I just don't understand it. I mean, they're so quick. The left and the media in general is so quick to call out an attack on any other religion, but when it's in Christianity, it's downplayed. And yet, these are the same people who call for tolerance. These are the same people who say that Trump supporters are not tolerant. These are the same people who say that we are the problem. But they don't get it. It doesn't make sense. And that's the craziness of today's political realm, is that nobody slows down to really think about the things that they say. Nobody really slows down to think about the logic behind some of these things. So that is my rant for this last week on what's happened on the political realm. And then my next one, moving into it, is the whole comment from Ilhan Omar, and I apologize if I did not say her name right, but from the Representative Ilhan Omar, which, by the way, out of all the representatives we have in Congress, I don't know why we pay attention to only specifically her in the media. There's so many representatives, and I don't say that in a mean way. I'm just like, where are the others at? It seems like she's always in the media. But Jesus, yeah, it's true that Jesus was obviously in the Middle East. We know that from the Bible. We know that from history, that Jesus walked in Israel, that Jesus lived and came to this earth and died in Israel. We know that. We know that his ministry happened in Israel. But Jesus was a Jew. He was the Jewish Messiah. And I know that there are those out there that obviously would disagree with me. But as a Christian, we know that Jesus was a Jew, that he was a Messiah to the Jews, that he was of the line of David. And even just looking at this claim, the idea that she would say that Jesus was a Palestinian, that means that Israel actually had the land over 2,000 years ago then. So what she's saying is that Israel actually has rights to the land, apparently, which I believe they do. But even just the logic behind that. So no, I don't believe it was the best choice of terms. I believe she... But as a Muslim, of course she's going to try to claim this, because the Palestinians don't get along good with the Jews. And anything I might say about that, you guys are welcome to correct me if you have a different viewpoint. But I don't believe it was the best of terms. And that's the problem, is that we're so quick to say keep God and keep religion out of the government, but yet we allow in these Muslims, we allow in these people, and I would even say that about even others perhaps from other religions, that come and yet they have the liberty to be able to express their beliefs in this way. And that's what I just don't get, and somebody can help me out. And I don't have Islamophobia. I'm not scared of Muslims. I had a Muslim friend. I have a Muslim friend. I'm not scared of Muslims at all, but it's this idea that one religion, Christianity, is downplayed while other religions are okay to get away with, are okay to preach what you want, say what you want, do what you want, but as soon as you bring Christianity in, no. Sorry, that's just a little rabbit trail there. But that's how I feel. So those are kind of the two biggest things. Oh, and I'm sorry, the other big thing is that Biden announced his run for the 2020 presidential primaries and presidential election. And really, there's actually a lot of candidates in the 2020 primaries right now that have announced, for the Democrats, that have announced their run. There's quite a bit, actually. And we're going to touch on that in our future podcast. So, that's kind of where we're at. We've got a lot planned for the next podcast. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and go with book that I recommend for the week, or the book that I recommend for this podcast. The book that I recommend for this podcast is See Something, Say Something. It's an older book. It's been out for a few years. And I'm going to recommend some older books as well in this podcast because there's so many books in the world that you can't possibly read them all. So obviously it does not hurt to recommend more books. The book See Something, Say Nothing is a good book. It's written by Philip Haney and Art Moore. It is a book that basically explains a lot of the cover-up that happened with various terrorist attacks and even just the stuff that we knew about terrorist attacks. It deals with Homeland Security. It deals with kind of an inside look at ISIS as well. It's just a really good book. So that's my book that I recommend. And I also, just as a closer, just the media topics, the media stuff that we have going on now. Endgame comes out tonight. I'm really excited about Endgame. I wish I could go see it, but I will not be able to go see it tonight. But I will be going Saturday, so that's happening. I'm super excited about Endgame. So that is hitting theaters this weekend. I'm sure it's going to just blow ticket sales out of the water. Super excited about Endgame. I'm even excited about Captain Marvel being in Endgame. I believe she's in Endgame. And I went and saw that movie. So yes, even though I am a Trump supporter, I still went to see Captain Marvel. And I think that that's just, important to point out. Because I know there was a lot of comments about, well, I don't want to go see the movie because it may have political stuff in it. Well, I have something to break to you. Every movie may or may not have political stuff in it because it comes from Hollywood. But that's my own viewpoint on all of that. You not going isn't going to make or break anything. So I'm really excited about that. Other movie that I want to see is Unplanned. I'm going to give a shout out that you take time to go see Unplanned. It's a movie. It's a pro-life movie. It's about abortion and the reality of abortion. And so, yeah, those are my movies recommendations. And so get out, go see a movie, go see Endgame, go see Unplanned, go spend all your money at the movie theaters. That's cool. To close off, I got a joke. In recent news, there was a man who had a stuttering problem. He went to prison. He got out early because he couldn't finish his sentence. So that was free. I won't charge for that one. And thank you for listening to The Divided Line. And we'll see you next time.